So we are in John chapter 1, verse 19. John chapter 1, verse 19.
John writes some really long chapters. He's long-winded.
Yeah, he has stuff to say.
Yeah.
Well, this is the last thing he's going to say. He knows, he's making his last statements. He's an older man. All the other apostles are gone. This is the latest written gospel. So he's adding pieces that he feels like people need to know.
Is he on Patmos when he writes?
No, we don't believe so. We believe he's in Ephesus.
Ephesus.
That's what it's believed. So in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, what's the first thing that John thought was so important to set straight right from the beginning?
The deity of Christ.
That Christ was God. That God was God and Christ was God, right? He demonstrates it in multiple ways. In the very first verse, he uses that verb, that Greek verb, that means always was, always is, and always going to be. And he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. So he's making Christ equivalent to the I am. The I am. Remember when God said, I am? That's that same kind of idea. I always was, I always will be, and I'm here now. And so John thought that was the most important thing for us to focus on. Do you remember when we had the pastor come and preach about sharing the gospel, and he gave us that track that talked about what's the first thing you need to do when you talk to people about Christ? Is that you need to talk with them about God, who God is, that God is the creator of all that we see, and that he established this plan for us, this way to come into relationship with him. So sometimes we don't focus enough on who God is. We assume that people know who God is or what he's like. And I think that's really important that John here focuses on God and that Christ was God. So it's kind of an interesting starting point, right? So let's take a look now at verses 19 to 51. John 1 says, verse 19, "Now this was John's testimony when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, 'I am not the Christ.'" Now, don't you hate that they just use John? I always get confused. John who? Right? There's John the Baptist, and there's this John that's writing. Well, the John who's writing only uses the word John to refer to John the Baptist. What does he call himself?
The one that Jesus loved.
The one that Jesus what?
Loved.
Loved.
That's what he calls himself. Yes. That's what he calls himself. He says the one whom Jesus loved. He doesn't use the term John for himself. So when we see John here, we need to remember that he's talking about John the Baptist. Okay? So let's look at it again, verse 19, chapter 1, verse 19. "Now this was John's testimony when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, 'I am not the Christ.' They asked him, 'Then who are you? Are you Elijah?'" Now, do you know why they would ask whether he was Elijah?
Elijah was taken up.
Aha! In 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 11, Elijah didn't die. He was taken up. So if John the Baptist comes back, then maybe he's Elijah, right? If he's not the Christ, maybe he's Elijah, because Elijah didn't die. Let's go on. "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." Finally they said, "Who are you? Give us an answer to take back to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" John replied in the words of Isaiah the prophet, "I am the voice of one calling in the desert, make straight the way for the Lord." That's in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. So now some Pharisees who had been sent to question him, "Why then do you baptize if you are not the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" "I baptize with water," John replied, "but among you stands one you do not know. He is the one who comes after me, the thongs of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. This all happened at Bethany on the other side of the Jordan where John was baptizing. Okay, so baptism was not an uncommon thing to be practiced. People did baptism and washings and ceremonial washings at the time. It wasn't like something so odd, but you would do it for a purpose. And they're saying, why are you baptizing? What's this you're doing? Now everyone's going up to the different feasts and stuff that we see here in this area. They would come up to Jerusalem for the different feasts that they're following. When they would come to Jerusalem, they would cross the river at Jericho. So people coming from this north side would come alongside this eastern side of the Jordan River, and then they would cross the river around Jericho. And Jericho was a pretty good city, so you could stay there. And it was about 3 days from where Jesus lived. They make usually 3 days trek. So 1, 2, 3 to Jericho. And then you'd rest in Jericho, and then you'd walk up the hill to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was up on a hill. So that's why they always say going up to Jerusalem, because it was a little bit of an incline. So we don't make a big deal about that because we're not walking, right? Yeah. Right? When you get in your car and you drive places are close. Oh, it's only 50 miles away. Yeah, well, put your shoes on and see how long that 50 miles is, right? And it's no big deal to go over the mountains to the foothills. But imagine if you had to put your shoes on and walk over that mountain, right? It would take you a little while. So in this day, they had certain places where people would stop and rest. They had family all along the way and friends. They would camp, kind of make a day camp or a night camp. And they would travel together. It was like a social kind of thing. And they went up for all these different feasts and stuff. This author that I'm working with, this commentator that I've been reading, he believes that Jesus was in the crowd at this moment. You know why he thinks that? Because later on, John the Baptist says that John says the next day, right? From this point, like if you look at verse 29, it says the next day. So there was one day, then there was the next day, and he identifies Jesus, and then 35 the next day, and then verse 43 the next day. And in that time, he says that Jesus is among them, and then he actually points out Jesus, and then Jesus talks and meets with people. Well, John the Baptist recalls when he baptized Jesus. But after Jesus' baptism, what happened? He went 40 days, and Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness, right? So if they had traveled for the feast, 40 days later, what would be happening? The next feast. The day of, is it Pentecost, Passover, and then Pentecost, or Pentecost and Passover? One comes first, the other comes second, and they had come up for the one feast, the one that he was baptized after, and then he went in the wilderness for 40 days. It would have been the time of the next feast. So at the time of the next feast, Jesus comes out of the wilderness. He's standing in the crowd, and John says here in verse 26, I baptize with water, John replied, but among you stands one you do not know. He is the one who comes after me, the thongs of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. Interesting, huh? So let's keep going on here. Oh, by the way, I want to mention about baptism. Baptism was very common. One of the Qumran, which were, they were a little wacky. They, like people, John the Baptist was a little wacky himself, right? You remember that he wore camel hair tunic. Camel hair tunics stink, by the way. And a big leather belt. And what did he eat? Locusts. So he had a little bag of locusts. He'd pull out. He had hair that had never been cut. He's 30 years old. So his hair is like, I'm thinking of dreadlocks. Like, you see those people with really long dreadlocks like that, right? So he attracts a little bit of attention. He was a little bit of an oddball. On purpose, he was trying to attract attention. That was his goal. Well, the Qumran community was a community of kind of like monks, and they had a lot of quirky behaviors also. And they did a lot of this baptizing and washing also. But the Jews, as a matter of practice, did many ceremonial washings that were governed by the law that they followed for food and rest. And they had what was called a mikvah. Have you ever heard of a mikvah? A mikvah is kind of the size of a jacuzzi, like that size, and it would have steps going down into it. And they would, in the afternoon, before the main meal of the day, which would be early in the afternoon, they would go into the mikvah and wash and come out and get dressed for what was called dinner, for the main meal of the day. And that was the ceremonial washing. So this idea of being baptized or washing was not an uncommon one, and it was used by the Qumran and John the Baptist and others as a symbol of being cleansed. It was, and the term baptism actually means to dunk. So when you went into the mikvah, you were doing a ritual immersion, and you actually went down all the way into the water. That was a daily ritual that the Jews practiced, especially the affluent Jews who could afford their own little mikvah, right? So it was before the main meal of the day. So when John the Baptist was doing this baptizing, he's down at the river at that crossing of Jericho. So everybody is seeing him, seeing what's going on, and they're talking about it. And they're all going up to Jerusalem for this feast. So when they get to Jerusalem, they're talking about it. So the Jews sent a little delegation to come and find out what's going on. Who is he saying that he is or not, or what's the deal with him? And so that's why he was answering those questions. So now John tells us that on verse 29, the next day. So now we're on day 2, right? We had day 1. It says, so here's the next day. John saw Jesus coming toward him. See, it's only been one day. The day before, he identifies him in the crowd. Day 2, John sees him coming toward him. Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is the one I meant when I said, a man who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. I myself did not know him, but the reason I came baptizing with water was that he might be revealed to Israel. Now, what do you mean John didn't know him? John is the same age as Jesus. In fact, he was in the womb at the same time that Jesus was in the womb. Remember when Mary came and John leapt in his mom's womb? Remember that story? Okay. But would you expect the guy that you grow up with, your little kid cousin that you play with in the dirt, that's the Messiah?
You wouldn't think so.
That would be a little odd, wouldn't it? In other words, John and Jesus knew one another, but there came a point at which John realized that Jesus was the Christ. Then that was revealed to him. When was that? I don't know. He says here, I myself did not know him. So he didn't recognize him or understand that was the Messiah. Now, there are a lot of stories about Jesus when he was a child doing miracles. Have you heard them? There's some good ones. They were written about the 4th, 5th century. There's like a book of miracles Jesus did when he was a kid. One of them was how did it go? That someone fell from a tree and he helped them up and they were well when he helped them up. They had fallen from a tree and he helped them up. There's another one where in that one, Mary looks out the window and sees Jesus healing his leg or something so that he could get up after falling from the tree. There's another story where it says that Mary looked over and saw that Jesus was playing in the dirt, in the mud. And she didn't think anything of it. She went about doing her work. But then she noticed that there was a bird flying up. And she looked over and noticed that Jesus was taking the dirt, forming it together, and creating birds that then flew away. Those are all a bunch of baloney. That'd be in the book of baloney. You know why? Because pretty soon we're going to see where it says Jesus did his first miracle. So, yeah, that was the first miracle. But those are fun stories, aren't they? Yeah. So John hadn't heard any of those stories. He didn't know any of that. It hadn't been written yet. It wasn't hindered until 500 years later. Those things were written down. But the point is that John the Baptist is growing up with Jesus, and he doesn't know that Jesus is Jesus until later, until it's revealed to him. So,
Believe in those stories.
pardon?
I don't believe in those stories.
Well, they weren't written until 500 years later, so, you know, a lot of things get spread around, rumors, you know, things get put around.
John
Yes,
was out in the wilderness most of the time.
he was. Yeah, because he was stinking. Ooh.
Wasn't there someplace in the scripture that said Jesus was teaching in the temple at 11? His
Yes,
age?
he was teaching, but we don't see anything about any miracles. But there was a sign there. And it makes you wonder where along the time that John the Baptist began to recognize it. Whether he had a knowing or, you know, I was
At
curious.
that time, you would have thought that John the Baptist would have recognized something.
Well, he might have, but would he have connected it to the Messiah? I don't know. That's interesting. I wonder I'm sure when he baptized him and the dove sat on him and he heard the voice of God, he knew it then for sure. And so this is the first time after that would have happened before this, in verse 19. Before that, that would have happened because Jesus is in the crowd on this day, and the next day, John the Baptist identifies him again. So that baptism would have happened, and then the 40 days, and then back day by day. We're going to see this in let's go ahead here so we get to it. In verse 32. Well, let's start with 31. I myself did not know him, but the reason I came baptizing with water was that he might be revealed to Israel. Then John gave this testimony, I saw the Spirit come down from heaven as a dove and remain on him. I would not have known him, except that the one who sent me to baptize with water told me, the man on whom you see the Spirit come down and remain is he who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. I have seen and I testify that this is the Son of God. So when that baptism took place, that's when John knew. All that time he had grown up and known Jesus as his cousin or whatever, and they'd come. They would have seen each other. It was common for families to gather at these different feasts and stuff when they would come to Jerusalem. And like I said, when they would travel together, you know, they'd travel in groups of families and the kids would go play. That's kind of how Mary lost track of Jesus, because he didn't come along with the family group when they traveled. And she's going, anybody see Jesus? Oh, he's not with anybody? We better go back and see where he's at. So the same kind of thing there. He's saying John the Baptist knew him and had been around him.
As Jesus was growing up, he had to have played with some kids, like everybody does. How come none of them became his disciples? He never called any of them. He always called people that he knew about them. But, you know, it's like saying, well, so-and-so was my best friend in high school. So when I do things after high school, we pal around together. But
They were family.
Well, I don't know if I would want to try to be the mind of God, but I would imagine that God chose those apostles specifically for the purpose that they were going to fulfill. And I would imagine that not just anyone would fill the slot. 11 of the 12 were killed by being martyred. So that's, I mean, you're going to have a certain kind or quality of person that's going to be able to endure what they endured during their life. So I would imagine it was a special calling, and not just anyone would be a part of that. I don't know. That's a good question. You got your list? You write that on your list. Vern?
Didn't he have one brother, James, that became the leader in the church and maybe even wrote the book of James?
Well, yes, but also during the time that he was growing up, his brothers were not real supportive.
No.
They kept saying, "Hey, you're making a fool of yourself. Come on, let's get,
Yeah,
you're,
later.
yeah." So later on, he becomes a leader in the church. But yeah, we have record of the brothers and the mom coming to get Jesus because he was, talking big. So.
You thought he was a little wacky.
Yeah, you get a little wacky, Jesus. Come on, let's get you home again, right? We've got medication for you, right?
I wasn't going to say it.
I know.
John the Baptist, though, he knew who Jesus was, it says, from the one who told me to baptize with water. So is he talking about God?
When John the Baptist baptized Jesus, a dove came down,
Right.
and God's voice from heaven said, "This is my son in whom I am pleased." So he heard directly from God at that baptism. So from what we can tell, that's when he knew.
Oh. I was thinking,
From what he's saying here, it sounds like that's when he knew.
I would not have known him except the one who sent me to baptize with water told me.
So God told John the Baptist to go baptize with water. He was baptizing anybody who would, and saying, "I want you to be ready for the Messiah, because the Messiah is coming and the time is near. So are you going to accept this Messiah that's coming?" And they would be baptized in water. And so now now after Christ has passed, now they're baptized in the Holy Spirit. So yeah, and the Word of God that came on Jesus was what convinced John the Baptist. Yeah, this is it. I feel confirmed now. This is the thing. It would be pretty odd. I mean, like, let's say that, a year from now, we get this voice from God saying, "I have destined Vern to be my great prophet in Welton." We'd all be going, "Vern?" Right? I mean, John the Baptist grew up with Jesus. He's just another kid, a cousin, and he hasn't done any miracles yet. We know because the water to wine was the first miracle. So is there any...
Been surprised.
It would have been interesting anyway, right? It would have been an interesting thing. We'd all be going, "What?" So,
Especially a guy like that who lived out in the desert and ate locusts for food and stuff like that. He was way out there.
he was definitely a weirdo. Unlike Vern, who's much more normal than that. Well, maybe not.
Does that mean the hippies of the day were the true seekers? They were
Maybe so. I don't know if they even ate locusts though. But why was John why is John telling us about John the Baptist anyway? In other words, he spent that whole first part of chapter 1 showing us that Christ was God and that they're the same. And now he's doing this spiel on John the Baptist. So keep that in mind, that question. Why is John the Apostle, why is he so concerned about John the Baptist? We know one thing he's already mentioned is the prophecy, right? That there was prophecy that said that there would come one in the wilderness calling, so John the Baptist is that one calling, saying the way of the Lord is coming, right? So it's a fulfillment of prophecy. But let's keep reading here and looking for, why does John the Apostle want us to know about John the Baptist? What's the big deal? Okay, so now we have that he was prophesying like was told in the Old Testament, plus we have that he baptized Jesus. So that's a marker event, right? Okay, let's take a look now at verse 35. The next day, there was again in other words, we're on another next day. So this is what day? Third day, day 3. There were again 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus, turning around. Jesus saw them following and said, "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying and spent that day with him. It was about the 10th hour. Bum, 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 bum. See the word 10th hour?
Yep.
Guess what?
4 in the afternoon.
I didn't know this. The 10th hour is a point of argument about whether John's gospel matches with the other gospels, because the times are all off compared to the other gospels. But what they found is that in the time of Jesus' time, some people would use Jewish time and some people would use Roman time. And I wrote it down. It said here that Jewish time, Jews started the time when the sun came up. But Romans started from midnight. What do? We use Roman time. Okay? So John uses Roman time. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke use Jewish time most of the time. So they're talking about from when the sun comes up. So that's why when we get to the end, there's a discrepancy between when Jesus rose from the dead in the time that is mentioned. Because John uses Roman time and Matthew, Mark, and Luke use Jewish time. Hey, did you learn something new today?
Yes.
I didn't know
So it
that.
wasn't 4 in the afternoon,
No, it was 10 in the morning.
10 in the morning.
It was actually 10.
Okay.
Yeah, mine says 4 in the afternoon.
Uh-huh. If you were using Jewish time, yeah. Jewish time is from when the sun comes up. Roman time is from midnight. So the Roman 10th hour in Roman time is 10 a.m. Apostle John uses Roman time. And that's a discrepancy between the Gospels that people will use to say that the Gospels are in conflict with one another. And it was a misunderstanding, too, that we didn't realize until later on in archaeology. You know, archaeology is not that old of a science. I need to adjust my time because when I first put up those posters and talked about archaeology not being old, it was only like 70 years old. So probably now it's 100 years old as a science. It's been a long time. But I'm just saying archaeology is one of the newest sciences we have. And there are a lot of things that have been discovered and changed as they've realized, you know, the errancy in some of the things they're doing. So this is one of them.
Our clocks go with Roman numerals on the clock. So that would indicate Roman time, I would think.
That'd be one way to remember it. Okay, let's keep going here. I'm sorry. We're on verse, let's see, the 10th hour. Verse 40. Andrew, Simon, Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah, that is the Christ." And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which, when translated, is Peter. The next day, one of the things that the commentator made a note about is that this almost sounds like sarcasm because Cephas is known to be one who's very impulsive and unstable kind of. And so some of them wonder if when Jesus says this, "I'll call you the rock," if it's like sarcastic, like saying you're the opposite of what others think that you are. You know, I don't know if that's true or not. I think that's pulling a little too much from that. But later, as we get to know Peter, we can see how that would come out. Okay.
Peter became the foundation of the church.
He became the rock. And so some would say that Jesus was viewed to what he was going to be, not viewing what he was. Verse 43. Just to make sure. Hey, we're on what day is the next day?
4.
Day 4. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? So, okay. You've all heard that story before, that Nazareth was a kind of a low-down town. It's where workers, people that were hardworking but small and not really anything remarkable. So can anything good come from there? "Come and see," said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him. Now, okay, this is when Jesus saw Nathanael. So Nathanael's the one who said, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Okay. He said, "Here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? You shall see greater things than that." He then added, I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, why did he all of a sudden believe just because Jesus said he saw him under the fig tree? That seems strange that Nathanael would believe because of that.
Well, it must have been a private moment, and he knew that there wasn't nobody else around.
Take a look, if you would, at Genesis 28. Genesis 28, starting at verse 10. What does the name Jacob mean? Deceiver, okay? Deceiver. So what if Nathanael had been reading this passage? Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Now, Jacob is the deceiver. What would Nathanael, if he had been reading this passage, be thinking about? Would he be thinking about, why did God honor Jacob in this way? Because Jacob's the deceiver. He didn't deserve to be honored in this way, right? That's what would have been the common thought. Look back then at this passage. I saw you, was his greeting. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said, here is a true Israelite in whom there is nothing false. What if Nathanael was thinking about how Jacob was a deceiver and how he didn't want to be a deceiver like Jacob? He wanted to be a man of truth, a man of honesty, a direct man. How do you know me? Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, I saw you while we were still under the tree before Philip called you. So it's almost like he feels like Jesus was reading his mind or knowing what he was thinking. Then Nathanael declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus answered, you believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You shall see greater things than that. He then added, I tell you the truth. You shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Back to the vision that Jacob saw of the angels descending, ascending on the stairway. Now, do you think that's too big of a jump?
Not for Nathanael.
Whatever it was that was in Nathanael's mind, what Jesus said touched him, right? And it could have been something like that. Like that was a common passage for Jews to read and to study. Perhaps he was reading that passage under the fig tree. And when Jesus made those comments, Nathanael knew that he knew not only that he was under the fig tree, but what he had been thinking and what he had been reading about. We don't know that for sure, but you can see how that would be convincing for Nathanael, wouldn't it?
Jesus did that with the woman at the well, too.
Uh-huh. That's right.
She knew.
You said it right. You've had, you're not married. Chapter 2, on the third day, a wedding took place. Okay, now on the third day, now wait a minute. What happened to the days here? It was the next day. I thought we were already on the fourth day. Okay, but look at 43. The next day, Jesus had to leave for Galilee. That's a 3-day trip. When they leave for Galilee on verse 43, on the fourth day, now they're going to make a 3-day trip to Galilee. It's like they went to this one point, now they're going up to Galilee. So on the third day of traveling, back up to town, because he's got to go to a wedding, right? So in chapter 2, we see he's arriving at the wedding that he was supposed to be at. And he brought everybody with him. All these people that came with him to the wedding, which is important to note because of what happens. What happens?
So that all took place on the third day?
No, the third day, the fourth day was the next day. In verse 43 was the next day, the fourth day. That's when that happened. But where are they going? They're going up to Galilee. So when they're going in measures 43 to 51, he has this interaction, but now they're going up to Cana of Galilee in order to go to the wedding. So they're on the third day of travel because it takes 3 days to go up. Do you see what I mean? So the fourth day in order, and then they went 3 days in a row. Now they're at the wedding. They traveled up to the wedding. So chapter 2 says, on the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Who invited them? Jesus. He picked them up along the way and brought them to the wedding. It was only 3 days later from the time he met them over in Jericho, in that area where they were down out by the river where John was baptizing, right? So in 3 days, he went up to the wedding, and he invited them to come along with him. So what happens? When the wine is gone, why did Mary go to Jesus when the wine was gone? You and your friends have drunk all the wine. If you hadn't brought all those people, we would have had
He
enough.
hasn't come yet, he told his mother.
Oh, yeah, he does, right? He makes an excuse, which we all would, right? They have no more wine. Dear woman, why do you... Oh, by the way, the reason it says dear woman is because there's no way in English to just say woman in a polite way. But this was a polite thing. What he says here is not, look, woman, leave me alone. But in English, it almost sounds that way. But the way it's written would have been with deference. It's a deferential thing. So she comes to him because he brought all of his friends to the wedding, and the wine is out already. And he says, dear woman, why do you involve me? My time has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Okay, so this is a true mother and son interaction, right? Right?
Yeah, why didn't he just say mother?
Okay, so you say to me, Laura, we're out of wine. And I say, Marta, what can I do? I don't have any wine. I'm not going to be able to provide any wine for anybody. And you say, do whatever make sure and do whatever she tells you to do, and you walk away. Whose responsibility is it?
Back at your son.
I can't help but wonder if maybe Jesus had performed a few little miracles as he grew up around his mother, and she knew his capability.
It does make you wonder, except for this. Look right here.
I never thought of that.
Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. By the way, these were common jars. 20 to 30 gallons is not common for us, but because they did all the different ceremonial washings, they would have jars of water sitting around. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, so they filled them to the brim. That would have been 120 gallons of water. It's a lot of water. Then he told them, now draw them some out and take it to the master of the banquet. The master of the banquet is the caterer. The caterer. The master of the banquet is the caterer, not the father of the bride, or however we think of it that way. But the master of the banquet was the caterer. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. He called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. It's like he's saying, oops, we didn't use the good stuff. We used the less stuff because now we've got the good stuff out. Like, oops, that's the caterer saying that. This, the first of his miraculous signs, there it is. Verse 11. This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. Now, Vern, I would say that the mother was putting responsibility on him for running out of wine. And I don't know that she was expecting him to do a miracle. I think we expected him to do a miracle because he's Jesus. But if this was his first miracle, she's not seeing any either. And so I think she was just saying, you better do something about this. Maybe he's going to go buy some wine or whatever he's going to do. He needs to take care of it because he brought his friends and they ran out. That's the essence that I'm getting from it, because it says here that this was his first miracle. So it makes you wonder if Mary, we assume she's kind of hinting that he could perform some magic trick. Now the other thing is that Jesus does never perform any magic tricks. Never. He doesn't perform any magic tricks. Why did he turn the water into wine? Look at the last statement there. And his disciples put their faith in him.
He's building a relationship with his disciples.
They saw all this. They saw all this happen. They knew he had been traveling with them for 3 days up to Cana of Galilee, so he didn't bring any wine with him. There's no fancy, slipping things in or out. They saw this whole thing happen. He didn't do it for his mother. He didn't do it for the bride or the bridegroom. He did it so that those disciples could see the power that he had.
To reveal himself.
And it had its result. It resulted in their faith in him. And many times when Jesus does miracles, he says, do you believe? Or he asks the blind man, what do you want? The blind man could have said, I want more money in my cup. I'm begging, right? The blind man has to say, I want to see.
So he knew.
That's the faith. So he knows who does it and why it's being done. Jesus does miracles to build faith. So in our world, if we don't get more faith from God doing miracles, why should he bother? If when he does miracles, we discount them and we don't give him the credit for it, then why would he bother to do miracles? John?
Well, I think his mother either knew that he could do this or something. Otherwise, why did she tell the servants to follow his directions, whatever he said to do?
Oh, yeah.
To me, that
Right,
is
except
an
that,
indication.
yeah, except that we assume, because we know the miracle that's going to be happening, we kind of assume that she knew he could do that. But I could imagine being at a party and having my son come to the house with 5 of his good buddies and eating all of my snacks that I had for the party. And I might say, Aaron, we're out of snacks and you need to do something about it. We've still got 3 more hours of party and we're out of snacks. And he might say, what am I going to do? And I would say, you guys, listen to what he says, whatever he plants. In other words, you're putting the responsibility on him. Now, I wouldn't expect for him to go poof and make cheese puffs appear. I would be expecting him to go out and get some snacks or go make up some stuff or whatever. And maybe that's what Mary was doing. Maybe what she was saying is, whatever you're going to do.
She's telling the servants to do whatever he said, which, in the context, the way it lines out, it looked like there was an indication she knew he could do something.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Except that it says that this was his first miracle.
Yeah.
Mary knew that Jesus was something special.
Right.
Yes. She'd known that since he was an infant. You know your own children.
Yes.
Plus,
That could be true.
when he was 12, he said, I need to be in my father's house. So she knew that there was, like this lady
Yeah.
said, there's something special.
Only I don't think that she would have thought the first thing he was going to do was turn water into wine, though. I don't think that would have been what she would have thought of as being. But who knows? We don't know. We don't know the thoughts of it. But it's interesting how it comes out here. This says that it's his first miracle, and it says that it created faith in those disciples. That the disciples saw what happened, and they put their faith in him. And so we know that's consistent with the rest of Scripture that we see. So I don't know. It doesn't say what Mary thought. I just know as a mother what I would be thinking. You better do something about it. You brought your friends to this dinner. You ate up all the snacks. We've still got 3 hours to go. But Mom, what am I going to do? I don't know, son. Take care of it. Boys, you need to make sure and take care of it. Adios.
Now you were just telling him, go to the store and buy something.
Right.
And she might have thought he was going to do that, go make things, but
Yeah.
I don't think she knew it was a miracle.
It's interesting. So we always look at the Bible from our perspective,
Right.
and we don't always look at it from their perspective. Okay, so we're going to start in chapter 2, verse 12 next time. 2 verse 12. Jesus is going to clear the temple. So glad that you all could join us this morning.